Welcome back to part 2 of my transformation back to fitness. So you may remember in the last video, I spoke about how I spent 10 months after moving to Greece, rebuilding my fitness back to where it is today. For those you don't know, I moved from the UK to Greece with my family to start a new life. However, in the process of doing that, I took a lot of time off my fitness and ended up losing a lot of it. I spent the first 3 to 4 months rebuilding my base and my strength on the bike. However, because of that and because it was a winter season here, I ended up putting on quite a few kilos along with that strength. At the end of that build phase, I ended up at a nice 86 to 87 kilos. Now, I wasn't happy with that, and for any of you that know cycling, you know that power to weight ratio, or watts per kilo, is very important. It's all well and good having a high power output or having a high FTP. However, if you're too heavy, you can't carry yourself up the hills very fast. So I went on a mission to drop 8 kilos in 8 weeks. But just how did I do that? So in today's video, I'm going to explain to you how I achieved that with a method called carbohydrate cycling. And before you get too excited, this isn't stuff like pasta and bread riding bicycles. This is in fact adjusting your carbohydrate intake throughout the week depending on your training program. So on higher intensity or higher volume days, you generally have more carbohydrates during your training. And on the opposite end, on lower intensity or lower volume training days, you decrease that amount. So before we can go into too much depth about carbohydrate cycling, you need to understand where your calorie intake or your calorie regulation starts at. So from a basic level, we need to look at your BMR. Your BMR stands for your basal metabolic rate. Now, I like to think of this as the cost of keeping the lights on. This is literally the amount of calories you need to keep yourself alive. This is what you burn throughout the course of a day. This is highly personal and you will not be the same as someone else. Go online, find a calculator or use an equation like this one to figure out what your BMR is. Now, once you know your BMR, you can use another multiplier equation, such as this, depending on your activities during the day, to work out what's called your TDEE. Now, your TDEE stands for your total daily energy expenditure. This is what you're going to burn throughout the whole course of the day. You can, if you like me, you can take away your exercise. I do this. I don't count my cycling exercise within this equation. It makes it a lot more simple when you're going into calculating your carbohydrate cycling. So your TDE is everything you do throughout your day. This includes sleeping, eating, your day-to-day jobs and chores. So again, this is going to vary highly depending on the individual, and it can vary day to day. However, we can use your TDE as your baseline calories, and we can adjust your carbohydrate intake on top of that. So for myself, at the moment, I am going back into a cut again. I am roughly having about 2,000 calories per day. This is worked out through my BMR times by an activity multiplier for my TDE. Then on top of that, I will then go into carb cycling, which I'll now explain. Now, as cyclists, it can be very hard to understand or regulate our carbohydrate or calorie intake in general. This is because cycling is such an intense and such a voluminous activity that it's hard to accurately understand how much we need to intake. And this can sometimes lead to weight gain or weight loss. So today I'm going to teach you a method of managing your weight on the bike, which is going to change the way you think about fueling. So, as I said before, it can be difficult for us as cyclists to understand how many carbohydrates or how many calories we need to intake for our training. However, some people may not realise that we can use a very important tool, a very valuable tool attached to our bikes to understand that and have a very good, accurate representation of what we need to intake. Now, for those of us lucky enough to have power meters on our bikes, we can use those power numbers to calculate our calories burnt during our rides. So it's roughly calculated out as for every watt you average per hour, you burn 1 kilocalorie per hour. So you can use your average power over a ride to work out how many calories you need to intake. Now, once you've worked out that equation, you can then go on and work out how many carbohydrates you need to take in. Now, as you know, you may have heard conversation around carbohydrates per hour for intake on the bike, but it can be very hard to understand exactly how many you need to intake. So the simplest method of doing this is once you've worked out how many calories you've burned, or you roughly will burn on the bike, you can divide this number by 4. This will give you how many carbohydrates you need to intake for that entire ride. Now, disclaimer on this, because these are rough calculations and nutrition is very personal to the individual, test this on yourself. Don't go out and solely eat what these calculations tell you. Try them, test them, adjust them up or down depending on your needs. For myself, I find that they work out pretty spot on. Some days, depending on intensity, I may have to raise them ever so slightly. So, if this works well for you, let me know. Feel that you've had to adjust it, also let me know. Let me know any other methods that you use to calculate your calories on the bike. So when you're on the bike, if you have a hard time understanding what you need to use to fuel yourself on the bike, I often like to fuel all of my rides with something like this, a carbohydrate powder. High Five is one of my favourites. It's very budget friendly, unlike some of the more expensive brands you might see out there. It's very cheap. I usually fill my bottles up with about 45 grams of carbs. It's very easy to regulate then how many carbohydrates you're having on your ride or per hour. I am not a fan of having anything in my stomach while I'm riding apart from water and this stuff. So I often won't opt for many real foods, bars and things. I just don't like having it on the bike. This is personal to me. I do like gels. I will intake gels. But it does mean when you're carbohydrate cycling, this stuff is amazing because you can really regulate how many carbohydrates you're having on the bike. So, as I said before, I managed to get from 86 kilos down to 70 kilos. I lost a significant amount of weight. I managed to get my watts per kilo up to around 4.15 watts per kilo. I was very happy with that after losing a great amount of fitness. I needed this because in the coming months, I would have some events coming up, one of them being a race around a mountainous island, which I did quite well on. So, come back for the next video where I will take you through that race and I will explain to you why carbohydrate cycling and the weight loss was very important to achieving the goals that I did in this race.